Hi, everybody, and welcome to this evening's broadcast from the New Haven Symphony. I hope you've had a good week so far, and I'm really looking forward to spending the next few minutes in your company and also with my special guest tonight, one of my favorite longtime musical collaborators and somebody who I'm thrilled to introduce to New Haven audiences next year in our January concert when he will be playing the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto. It's a great pleasure to welcome from Chicago my good friend and colleague, the wonderful violinist Vadim Gluzman. Good evening, Vadim.
Good evening, great to see you, Alasdair.
How are you doing under the circumstances?
Well, to be honest, I think better than I expected. Of course, we all talk about it, all my colleagues and friends, the touring musicians, we all say, here, this is our chance to spend time with our families, with our loved ones. So this is the first silver lining, that the most obvious one that we can find. Other than that, there is quite a bit of playing violin, still preparing for the season ahead, which we'll look forward to and hope it will come back in one way or shape or form or another. Teaching, reading, and quite a bit of Netflix.
Netflix and chill seems the order of the day. Well, as I mentioned, you're going to be playing for New Haven audiences for the first time, and hopefully people watching tonight might have had a chance to check out their emails and see the wonderful little offering that you made for us as a musical appetizer to tonight, the Dance of the Blessed Spirits. It's a wonderful example of your phenomenal artistry. People will be able to see that in the flesh next season. But I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about yourself, how your journey from your birth to where you are now in Chicago, what that consisted of.
Well, I'll try to make a quick story that consists of 46 years. I was born in what used to be Soviet Union. Started playing violin when I was 7. Despite my parents' disapproval of that, both being musicians. I studied back in Soviet Union in Riga. That was the capital of Latvia. Followed by a 1-year visit to Novosibirsk, the capital of Siberia. And then my family repatriated to Israel, and I've been Israeli since I'm 16 years old. All my family is there. At which point I realized that a lot of things that were taught to us in Soviet Union were questionable, to say the least. And this breath of fresh air brought an incredible excitement, incredible inspiration, and also confusion. I continued my studies in Dallas, on to New York, and now my family splits between Chicago and Tel Aviv. Right now we're in isolation in Chicago.
The story so far, as they say.
Yeah.
I should also add for our viewers that I'd encourage you to please use the chat feature. And as I am throwing out questions to Vadim, feel free to chime in, and I will relay some of your questions for him as this interview continues. So I guess what I wanted to ask you, since you cite a number of important teachers and mentors in your life, if you could be so kind as to talk about 3 of them in particular. Arkady Fomin, with whom you studied in Dallas, and then Dorothy Delay at the Juilliard School, another famous pedagogue, and also Mr. Stern, Isaac Stern, whom we both knew, in fact, but who was for you a very special influence and mentor. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about each of these 3 formative influences on your life.
Of course, with pleasure. Well, let me start with Arkady Fomin, probably the name that very few will recognize. as I mentioned, the period in Israel when I arrived, the freedom and all the inspiration and confusion that it led to, it led me to a point where I, as many teenagers do, I doubted my future and doubted whether I was even destined for a career in music. As much as I loved it, and I always knew I can't really live without it, but I didn't see myself playing as well as I could. And a chance encounter with Pinchas Zuckerman, who listened to me play and said, Wojciech, why don't you come and take classes with me in Dallas, Texas? I'm teaching there at the summer festival. I gladly did. And the first week of the festival that Pinchas was still not there, he was arriving the following week, I met the director of the festival, a violinist called Arkady Fomin, who, after giving me one lesson on a piece that lasts exactly 3.5 minutes, and the lesson lasted over 3 hours, it was one of those moments in life when you know that you are right. I remember sitting on the floor in front of him and saying, I don't care how and what do I need to do, but I have to study with you. Long story short, half a year later, I was in Dallas studying with him. He literally took me from considering quitting violin to starting an international career. And that was in the span of 3 years.
What was it about his method, or what was that connection that made you make a pretty amazing decision? I mean, I'm astonished to know that there was a time that you were even considering not being a violinist, but to have that as a turnaround point in your life. What were some of the things that made him such a special person?
I think looking back at it, and this is now well over 25 years, it's almost 30, he had the most incredible, the most contagious belief in his students. And that belief was granted to us we sucked it in a way. It gave an incredible comfort and knowing that yes, we can. And he had, like all great teachers, this is to me an indication of a great teacher. He had a different key for every door, for every student.
Mm-hmm.
And with me, we really, over the years, we've become extremely close. He became like another father to me. And our families since then have been inseparable in all phases of life, happy and not so happy. But he's, I think, as opposed to most of teachers that I have encountered in Soviet Union, where extreme pressure and very harsh criticism was the way to go, to the extent of almost humiliation. Mm-hmm. Here I met someone who told me that not only there is no doubt I can do it, not only sky is the limit, that he is going to celebrate with me each and every note that I play beautifully. And that basically changed my life.
It sounds to me then it was less a technical and physical issues that he was dealing with, more psychological.
Most importantly psychological, but at that same time, he physically basically rebuilt me from ABC.
Uh-huh.
Everything was taken apart and put back in the correct order.
I had a similar experience as that when I was an undergrad, and I studied flute with who was the principal of Covent Garden at that time, and he said, "Fine, I'll take you on, but you have to spend the next 3 months playing hours and hours a day in front of a shaving mirror, just long notes, because you're going to have to change your embouchure, which is, like change your bow grip or whatever."
That's exactly what it is.
but it was done also in a very, very supportive and non-judgmental way, and I went with it, and I don't know, I guess I understand what you're talking about, I think. You then went on to Juilliard. Is that the narrative after that?
That's correct. At Mr. Fomin's insistence, once I was graduating from his class, and to his credit, he was not one of the teachers who would hold on to a good student for dear life, not letting them go. He in fact encouraged that you've taken everything there was to take from me. I've given you everything I know. Now it's time to go. And he called Miss Delay, and they've been very good friends for many years by that time. And he told her that there is this young man, and he feels that she is the right person for me to go. And oh boy, was he right.
Mm-hmm. So Dorothy Delay, for those that may not know, was probably the most single famous pedagogue of any instrument in the United States for, I would say, for many decades. And her laundry list of amazing former students is considerable. It certainly includes Vadim, but is by no means limited. Is that fair to say?
That is absolutely very elegant way of putting it. Yes, Miss Delay taught, well, you name it, a violinist, almost every great violinist of the last 50, 60 years at some point was her student, and it's not surprising. She truly was a genius. She was probably the wisest person I've ever met, still until today. And like what I mentioned about Arkady Fomin, she knew exactly what you needed at a given time. That was really, really stunning. I don't think I appreciated it at the time. I don't think I realized. I was in my early 20s. I started to give concerts. I was just at the beginning of what I thought was, and I was in a way right, was going to be an exciting career. And I was eager and wide-eyed and whatnot. And her advice, I come back to it time and again today, so often. It's incredible. It's been now 20 years, 25 years, and I will play the opening of this third movement of Brahms Concerto, and almost every time I play it on stage, I remember her gesticulating to me a certain technical stroke that she wanted me to produce, and I will never forget. Once I got it, 2 thumbs up in the air. To me, at that point, I was ready to levitate. See these 2 thumbs.
Absolutely, that's the best praise imaginable, because I imagine it didn't come every single time.
Not at all. No, she was exceedingly nice. She was extraordinarily sweet and supportive, but praise, that was something else. Praise was reserved for special occasions.
Yeah. And last but not least, the great Isaac Stern.
Well, he was present in my life from literally week after I arrived in Israel in 1990 up until 1 month before he passed away. Excuse me, 3 months before he passed away in 2001. I made what today I consider a fool of myself by marching into Jerusalem Music Center upon hearing that Isaac Stern was listening to young violinists. I had no idea, of course, that things like this were scheduled 2 years in advance and people were preparing. And here I am. Well, I honestly had no idea, coming from Soviet Union just a week before that, speaking no language whatsoever besides Russian, and announcing myself to the secretary at the reception that here I am. And she said, well, welcome to the club, but you will have to wait a few years. And to my yes, and to my luck, Isaac marched in through some door into the lobby, pointed at me and asked her, "Who is this?" And she said, "Well, here's a boy who came from Nana. He says he wants to play for you. I don't know what to do with him." And he said, "Okay, go to that room, warm up. I'll have 5 minutes in a couple of hours. Just wait." I went, warmed up. I was called a couple of hours later when the audition was over. And 5 minutes turned into an hour and a half, at the end of which I had quite a clear picture that I know absolutely nothing about music in general or violin playing in particular. And yet I had a violin that I could actually play, as opposed to a cigar box that I brought with me from Russia.
Mm-hmm.
I had a stipend to buy strings and music, and I was told, "Come back in a year, and I would like to see what you make of yourself." And I kept playing for him up until last time, which was back in New York. Miss Delay said, "I think you're ready to show Isaac your Brahms." And that was Brahms' first sonata. So,
you made it.
And my wife, at the time already my wife, Angela, and I went and played it for him on Park Avenue at his apartment. That was the last time we played. And it was the first time he smiled when I played, which was quite an amazing moment, because he was never satisfied with anything, and that is in the most positive way. His motto was, "What can we improve?"
Mm-hmm.
It was not about what has been done. Great job. That was not interesting. What was interesting was, how do we get to the next stage, to the next level? How do we become always better? It's something that became in a way part of my motto.
Yeah, I mean, I think every serious artist has to have that as part of the psyche. It's never, since we know empirically that perfection can't be reached. We just have to say, well, how many degrees closer can we get this time around? And that's the eternal challenge. Caitlin Daly Gonzalez, our wonderful education director, would love to know what instruments or otherwise your parents played, because you mentioned that they were both musicians.
Well, my father is a clarinetist and conductor, and my mother is a musicologist. She started off as a pianist, but then she turned to musicology. They're both retired now, but they spent all their life, and they still do. Of course, once a teacher is always a teacher. They've been teaching forever on pre-college, college level. Our house has always been full of music and young musicians. It was always a soup of sound.
A soup of sounds.
Yes.
Beautiful, beautiful. Let's talk about your instrument, if we may. You play a Stradivarius, which is not just any old violin. And in fact, you don't just play any old Stradivarius either. Would you like to tell us a little bit about the instrument and its provenance?
Sure, it is quite a special violin. In fact, it's right next to me. I'm happy to introduce her.
Aha, her leadership.
In Russian, and it is still my mother tongue, of course, violin is feminine. So this lady was built in 1690 in Cremona by Antonio Stradivari, and the provenance of this instrument is actually very special in light of our concerts in New Haven, because this violin belonged to the great pedagogue, and we can call him the father of the Russian school of violin playing, Leopold Auer, the teacher of Jascha Heifetz, of Nathan Milstein, Misha Elman. The list goes on and on and on. Mr. Auer was not only professor of St. Petersburg Conservatory, he was also what was called the Tsar's violinist, which meant that in his duties were playing in a string quartet, leading the St. Petersburg Philharmonic Society, and to play solos in all the great ballets that were presented in the Mariinsky Theater.
So like Swan Lake, the famous, that was written for Auer, huh?
Absolutely right. In fact, the composers like Tchaikovsky or like Glazunov were ordered to write the solos for violin because of Mr. Auer, because the court expected him to play the solo. So he had a little podium just next to the conductor's stand. He would march into the pit, play his solo and leave. Today it is played by the concertmeister, but back then all these famous solos that we all know and love from Swan Lake, from Nutcracker, from Glazunov's Raimonda, etc., all of these were played and written for this violin. And then, of course, both Tchaikovsky and Glazunov wrote their concertos for Mr. Auer. And of course, it is my imagination, but it is safe to assume that having worked with Auer regularly, they had his sound in mind when writing for him. And it is very inspiring to think that Tchaikovsky was writing that music, imagining sound of this violin, in a way taking this as an inspiration. So of course, this is extremely special.
Unbelievable just to see that thing in your hands there now, and just think of the history behind it. I mean, there are a lot of interesting stories behind Stradivari violins, but that definitely is one of the most special ones. But the Tchaikovsky Concerto itself had a little bit of a complicated birth, did it not?
It did, and in many ways, thanks to Mr. Auer. Because Tchaikovsky brought him the piece, brought him the score. Leopold Auer took the score, played it through on this very instrument, and gave it back to Tchaikovsky, saying, "Thank you, but no thank you."
Well, it was difficult, wasn't it? I mean, it still is. But
he proclaimed it anti-violinistic, unviolinistic. We don't know what has really happened. This is back at the time when Leopold Auer was at his prime. His violinistic powers are still absolutely at his height. 20-some years later, he premieres Glazunov Concerto, which, and it is a unanimous agreement between all violinists that I know, that the Glazunov Concerto is much more awkward and truly unviolinistic.
That's fascinating because it doesn't come across that way. Maybe just
no, it is just very awkwardly written, physically speaking, for violin. I can tell you from my personal experience, every time I play Glazunov, and we've done it together. In fact, our first meeting was Glazunov, right?
Exactly.
Every time I'm under a lot of stress playing Glazunov. It takes much more preparation, physically speaking, much more going to the violinist gym. So
you really have to be toned.
So what happened really, maybe Auer was in love and didn't feel like practicing, didn't want to learn a new piece. Who knows? Or maybe they were not in the best terms with Tchaikovsky. We can speculate all we like. Right. But the sad part is that Tchaikovsky not only had to withdraw the dedication, and he was, of course, heartbroken, like he was many times. He was one of the most sensitive musicians in history, from what we know. And it's interesting that these things happened to him over and over. The first piano concerto, which we can't imagine our life without first Tchaikovsky's piano concerto.
No.
And Nicholas Rubinstein, his great mentor and friend, told him that this was garbage.
Yeah.
And this is not this doesn't deserve any attention. And oh boy, did history prove him wrong.
We should compile a top 10 list of bad calls made by contemporaneous musicians or critics for all of the great pieces that have since become part of the repertoire. It might surprise people.
And speaking of bad calls, the premiere of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, having rededicated it to a gentleman called Adolf Brodsky, the concerto was premiered by Brodsky in Vienna, and the infamous Mr. Hanslich.
Oh, right, him.
He wrote that yesterday we found out that music can stink to ear. This quote, first of all, you must be a mean person to write.
Yeah.
There is no other way. And then to be so extraordinarily short-sighted, that's really nearsighted, I should say. It's really very special. But here we are. It's 2020, and we are playing Tchaikovsky Concerto.
Here we are. Tchaikovsky is very much with us, and Edward Hanslick is largely confined to the marginalia of musical history. But then we have this extraordinary piece that has been part of your life for so many years, and is inevitably part of what we call the Russian tradition. It's a word that's bandied about a lot. I'm wondering, does it mean anything special to you? Or is it, how would you interpret that? And I see personally, I see you as very much in whatever that phrase means, that you are very much the embodiment of that continuation of that tradition in your sound and your approach.
Well, I will take it as a compliment when we talk about Tchaikovsky Concerto. I might have a little bit of an unease if we talk about Bach and Mozart.
Right.
I mean, interpreting Bach and Mozart. Yeah. I think if I was to try to explain what do I represent as a musician, what school, although I do think that nowadays the concept of school, of national school, is largely gone, simply because of invention of what we're using this very second, and that it is internet. And then, of course, the break of the Iron Wall, which changed the world forever. I think it is more cultural than actually schooling wise. I feel that most naturally I belong to the Russian culture in a way that I was brought up reading Tolstoy and Bulgakov and Dostoevsky, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I heard all the great Russian symphonies before I heard Beethoven, because that was the traditional menu in the concert hall. But then, as far as what I remember as Russian or Soviet tradition of music making, I think by now I'm a real mishmash, compote of all sorts of traditions from, of course, Russian, which was my beginning. Yet my very first teacher in Riga, Latvia, who is still teaching, he's almost 90 years old. He came from German school. And then, of course, there was Mr. Braun, who really comes from Russian tradition, followed by Professor Kless in Israel, who came from Belgian tradition, and etc. And then Miss Delay, who was the product of the new American school. So who am I?
Well, people are going to find out who you are through this, through the Tchaikovsky Concerto, and if memory serves, they're going to get a wonderful insight into your musical personality. This is, I think, the third time we've done this together. Is that right? Tchaikovsky Concerto?
At least.
I think at least, right. We've done a lot of pieces. So, and I've done it obviously with many other people, and you have done it with even more people, I'm sure. So this question is, I mean, it's a loaded one in a sense, but do you find it a challenge to revisit something that's been part of your life for so long now and find something new? Are you just mining it constantly? How does it feel to come back for the 130th performance of the Tchaikovsky?
I think it would be more. If I were to count,
Really?
it would be more. But
yeah.
It is a challenge, but it is also, I take it as a source of inspiration. To challenge myself to look for something new, to look, and not new for sake of being different. This I truly do not like. I will not make a musical choice just to play it differently than everybody else, or differently than I played it 3 months ago. That's just wrong decision making for me. But my constant challenge is to question myself whether my intentions are in any way, at least, are in sync with those of the composer. And of course, all we do, all our life, I'm sure you will agree, we take something that looks like this. Long lines, some more shorter lines. That's what musical print looks like. And to make meaning out of it, make it into your own message, emotional and even intellectual. So that's the challenge each and every time I come back to a piece. But I think my advantage, and that of any soloist, we play with different orchestras, we play with different conductors, and one would have to be deaf not to react to what we hear coming from our colleagues on stage. So every conductor, if by grace of God we are in good musical relationship, will make an imprint on my interpretation, and I look forward to it each and every time. I think this is the most exciting thing about the live concert, is that spur of the moment, something that will happen only today, and it will never happen again. And no recording, with all my love for the recording industry and having made so many recordings, no recording can ever capture that. It's just impossible.
One of the things I think we're all learning through this epidemic is how little substitute there is for the real thing, and there's a tremendous desire to hear music live and in person because of all those elements that you just described. Carol Warshaw, a member of our viola section of the New Haven Symphony, would love to know, this is something I already know the answer to, but but she would like to know, at least I think I know the answer to it. Do you make some of the traditional cuts that one sometimes hears in the Tchaikovsky Concerto, or do you play it complete?
Well, yes, you know the answer, of course.
I hope I do.
I do make the cuts, and there are two sides to that decision. I learned this concerto much before the Stradivari that I just showed to you was lent to me by the Stradivari Society of Chicago. I learned it as a very young man. I was 17, I think, when I learned the piece. So by the time I arrive in New Haven, I will be playing that piece for exactly 30 years. And it was quite traditional at the time to make the cuts, which I did, and that's how it was done. I'm tempted today to say that I wish I didn't. Yet there is a sideline to that story, and it is that the cuts were instituted by Mr. Auer when he, 20 or 30 years after he declined the dedication, he came back to the concerto and he redeemed himself by teaching it to all his students, and all his students made this concerto into the blockbuster that it is today. He introduced a little changes to the concerto. He rewrote a couple of passages ever so slightly. He did make them a little bit more comfortable. I wouldn't say that this is a dramatic change. And he introduced a few cuts of 4 bars at a time here and there in the third movement. It does, in my opinion, help the overall structure of the movement to be more balanced and maybe symmetrical, but it takes a bit of maybe pepper out of it. But there is so much pepper in that movement that it is really hardly noticeable, if at all.
And they're also, we should say that they are fairly minor. I mean, as you say, just 4 bars here and there, and there's one maybe in the Menomosa section in the middle that's perhaps more
It's
like
it is 8 bars.
8 bars there.
Yes.
But this isn't like the kind of musical mutilation, let's say, that's vested on the Rachmaninoff Second Symphony, for instance, where huge paragraphs are just ripped out of the symphony, which is, to me, an unconscionable act of musical vandalism. But but the Tchaikovsky Concerto is, we're talking really much smaller units here. I have a question coming in from Ravi. And Ravi says, Vadim, when you perform with so many different artists in your travels, what do you most enjoy from those experiences? Life on the road, I guess.
Well, as far as performances are concerned, they don't, what I'm going to tell you about is not something that happens each and every time, and one cannot expect it to happen. But when, and I briefly mentioned it in the previous question about my few times that I've played Tchaikovsky Concerto, how does it feel? It is these moments when 2 people or 10 people or 120 people meet on stage and they happen to speak the same language. And they happen to support each other in almost subconscious way, where everything you do is almost by some kind of grace falls, all the puzzle pieces fall into place. This is, we call it moment of truth, and it happens from time to time, and these moments are extraordinarily dear to me, and it's unlike anything else. When you, and it happens sometimes, it happens to me with people with whom I've played in the past number of times, and it was maybe always a very good experience, but never extraordinary. And then a right piece arrives, a right choice of repertoire, and boom, something happens, and you come off stage and you realize that something unforgettable just happened. Or it sometimes never happens at all. Sometimes it happens right away. Like I dare say, for Alasdair and myself, the very first time we played together, it felt to me that like we've known each other for our whole life. And it was like this each and every time we met ever since.
It's true, actually. And here's an interesting question that is perfect timing, because a question has come in from one of our board members, David Chankup. He says, I understand, well, this is a loaded question, actually. I'll rephrase it in a way. I understand that you performed with Alasdair several times in the past. Do you ever look twice at an engagement because there's a conductor that you worked with that you might not care to do so again, or does it not really matter? How do you negotiate those things? I mean, you and I have this really fantastic relationship where we seem to have a sort of telepathic sense of what the other is thinking. That isn't necessarily all the time, right? I mean, we can say from both of us that sometimes I find that I'm not on the same wavelength absolutely as a soloist, and you probably find that as a conductor. Does that present challenges of its own?
Most definitely, and we take risks. I feel that each and every time I play with a new colleague, with a new conductor, it is always a risk. We can, of course, I can listen to his or her recordings, I can watch YouTube, but not until you finally stand on stage and start rehearsing. And even then it might not be apparent. But certainly not until that time that you will really know, will this work or not. And I have had number of experiences when rehearsals went extremely well, and I was absolutely happy and looking forward to the concert, and then something happened in the concert and nothing happened, and that was quite disappointing. But to answer the question, whether if I look twice, yes, and I think it is only honest to do it. I luckily I haven't had many instances that I had to refuse an engagement because of certain individual with whom I didn't feel we had a connection that could produce good results. But it has happened a couple of times, and I think in 25 or so years of being on stage, a couple of times is really not too much.
That's a pretty good batting average, if you don't mind me saying.
Absolutely, I think it's and I dare say that that in both, I think it's been only twice actually. That in both cases it was quite a mutual.
Sometimes you go on a date and it's just not happening, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and not every date is supposed to happen.
Exactly. Yeah, we can't always be all things to all people all the time.
Yes.
Maybe one more question before we wrap up here. I want to give you a chance to talk about something that's very close to your heart, the North Shore Festival that you have in your now hometown of Chicago. That's been part of your life and your wife's life for a number of years. Tell us a little bit about what that is and its importance in your life.
Well, it's a chamber music festival that we've held for 10 years now. Since we're not only live partners, we're also musical partners. We've actually started as musical partners and started dating after. We would go to festivals for years and years, especially all the summer festivals. They're so wonderful and exciting, and they're held in many beautiful parts of the world. And we would go and from time to time would sit over dinner and talk and say that, oh, if we ever had a festival, we would do it like these people did, and we would never do something like these people there did. And this conversation kept repeating itself until it turned into, and what if we had a festival? And that conversation went on for a few more years until one day we went grocery shopping from our home here in Chicago. We stopped at the traffic light, and Angela said, "Look at this church, isn't it beautiful? Why not check out if the acoustics are good?" And as if someone led us to that church, we came in. The first person we met was the church's music director, Dr. Chen, who retired 2 years ago. Long story short, 8 months after that, we had our first season. And it is a week-long event. We hold 3 concerts on Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. We bring to North Shore of Chicago friends that we are lucky to have accumulated throughout our travels and collaborations with all these great musicians. So it's a matter of phone call and asking, are you free in the first week of June? And very often, first week of June actually is free for many of us. It's this in-between season kind of time. And we've had some really extraordinary concerts. We established 5 years ago a scholarship fund in memory of Arkady Fomin, whom I mentioned before. We talked about him. We've given scholarships to over 40 kids. We've collaborated with School for Deaf Children. In that concert, I will never forget as long as I live, when you had a music group from a local music school playing Over the Rainbow, and a dancing group of the School for Deaf Children. This school is for profoundly deaf kids, those that do not hear at all. And they danced over the rainbow holding balloons, because that's the way for them to sense music through vibration of a balloon. That evening, I don't think I will ever forget. And there are so many more. And sadly, of course, this year we had to postpone. It would have been our 10th anniversary, but we will celebrate it next year.
And it'll be all the happier for the delay, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, listen, my friend, it's so lovely to have had this last 3/4 of an hour in your company, and I'm so grateful to you, I should say, for letting us in on parts of your life and getting to know you a little bit better. As I mentioned at the outset, you will be playing the Tchaikovsky Concerto with us next season, and in a season jam-packed with things that I'm eagerly anticipating, I have to say that the chance of us doing the Tchaikovsky again is absolutely the top of the list of things that I'm anticipating, and I can't wait to bring you to New Haven and explore this wonderful piece again together.
Likewise, I'm really looking forward to playing with you, playing on stage as opposed to my living room, and making music together. That's the most important.
Oh, well, here's to that. Can't come too soon. Thank you again. And thank you all for listening and watching this evening. I look forward to our encounter next week. And in the meantime, do take care of yourselves and remember to keep music at the center of your lives. Thank you all again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.